inspiring for me because I sense so many connections. Obviously, our work is quite different, but I think what motivates us, you will see, we have a lot in common. Why interiors matter. My name's Ilse Crawford. I have a studio in London. There are 15 of us. At the last count, I think there were about 14 languages. I've got Polish, Hungarian, Irish Chinese, Canadian Chinese, Greek. I'm half Danish, half Canadian. The list goes on. And we work around the world. But the thing we have in common is this. We are all absolutely obsessed by the idea that we can make spaces that make people thrive, that make us feel alive, that basically have visual qualities but engage with us as human beings and make us feel aware, active, energized by what's going on around us. Building interiors is a funny thing. There's something almost magical about it, because you start with nothing. You know, this was a picture we did on the building site, and I loved it so much. It was an accidental picture. And it seems as though they come from nothing. But yet, in the end, they can really change the way we behave and feel. And ultimately, that is what is so important about interiors, is they change the way we live, or can do. As a studio, we have very many disciplines. We have architects, product designers, we have thinkers, and we bring it all together. So, for example, when we do a project, this is a hotel in Stockholm, Ethem, we do everything. We don't just do the design, we, if you like, specify the style of operation, the style of service, we do the graphics, we direct the food, we do the communication, the whole thing, so that you get a whole experience. This is a little movie we made. But basically, we want a space to make you feel human.
And so, automatically, of course, it feels rather friendly. But the idea was very much to make a place that amplified, if you like, and enhanced the life you have when you're staying there. When we start a project, we definitely address the place. It's always looking at the particular nature of the place. So for us, it's about how to bring life to a place. That's the fundamental issue that we look at. Sometimes it's about looking into the history. Sometimes it's really just looking at the specifics of where it is right now. I don't believe in this idea of a sort of international miasma. I think the way to appeal is to have a very clear identity and sense of self. So our attitude here has been to make something that is very Swedish, but more about a Swedish perspective on the world. It's an attitude, it's a spirit, a way of looking at the world.
You should be able to live in the building, not feel like a visitor. So as a studio, we work from small to large. So product design, a table lamp, a task lamp we did for the Swedish Van Westberg, to large, a design strategy for an island called Fogo off Newfoundland, Canada. For a social entrepreneur, we designed a strategy where all the furniture for her project could be made by the fishermen on the island so that none of the money would leave the island. From private to public, residential, I'm fascinated by people. If you find me staring at you, it's because I'm constantly watching what people do. To public, the Barbican Arts Centre. We have been working with them on how to take what's so brilliant in their exhibition spaces into their public space. which kind of doesn't work. It's operational, but not very happy. From restaurant to retail, so a restaurant called Matthias Dahlgren, again in Stockholm, which built a whole world around this amazing Swedish cook who cooks in the way that his grandmother would have cooked, but updated. And so he built a physical expression of his food. To retail, Sergio Rossi, the shoe store, who did the flagship store in Rome and the rollout. These days, you don't need to go to shops, so they need to do something quite different. And in some way, be a story, the narrative of the brand, the magic, so that, in a way, you believe in it. It's a commercial thing, but it's also a playful thing. Because, in the end, it's all about life. We always start with the context and the content, so every project is specific to the place. And, for sure, interiors don't work in isolation. They are this frame for life. So, to have a truly inhabitable space, it has to address real needs. It has to address real life. And it also has to touch us at that deeper psychological level, those secret yearnings we have. It has to connect with us on that human level. Ultimately, when it comes to the insides of buildings, it's where we live out our lives. So a lot of the time, when we design the insides of buildings, we're really designing our lives. So I find it quite sad, actually, that a lot of the time today, there's a great deal of money invested in architecture, but sometimes the interior falls down the crack, partly because architects sort of take it on, but honestly, they're often not trained to do it and will admit it. Or contract furniture companies supply the furniture, but actually don't really supply the interior. And then there's also just the practical stuff that, you know, buildings run out of time and money. In the end, though, it's a mistake, because the interior, I think, can add so much value. Financial value, emotional value, human value. It's so important that I think it should be at the very beginning part of the strategy for any building. I'll give you a few examples why. Soho House Group. This is a company we worked with for a period of 10 years, and this is what it looked like when we started. A small club in London for media, advertising, film types. This is a space we took in New York, and this is what we made it for them. We ran out of money here and there, but hey, worked our way around that. It was a strange one because we spent a lot of money in some areas, and then in other areas we really did it rough and ready. This is another project of theirs, Babington House. We built the whole story around the values of that community, so it is rather cinematic, you might say, but also quite playful. It's built around their real needs, as well as some of their desires. This is a cowshed, their spa, but again playful, sociable. They never stop talking, so what would be the point of putting them in a private room? And having built this world for them, one that worked for them, a third space where they could work and play, it also became a very valuable thing. I don't know if you can see over there, but just 1998 was when we started working for them. And look at what happened to that line. Straight up. Now, design is not the only part of that story, but for sure, without design, that line would not have gone up. And half of the company was sold earlier this year for £250 million. So whoever says that design isn't valuable should think again. Now, You might think that, okay, that's fine, that works for hospitality, but it's not really relevant for the rest of the world. But actually, that's not true, because as Roseanne said, it's a way of looking at the world. We have this notion that work should be hard, it should be a punishment. I think that's a very Western European notion, but it's very embedded in the international workplace. But it's changing, and it's changing quite fast. So we had a big international corporation come to us recently, not Google, not Lego, nothing even remotely like that. Very serious. And they want us to make a space which, and the words will sound familiar, they want one where you interact, which will foster innovation, one that will attract and keep top young talent, and one that will reflect their brand. It's the same. So those same values, those human values, can work for many, many different applications. Many more than perhaps is conventionally thought about today. We even actually had an old people's care home come to us to ask us to think about that. And that, I think, is an interesting one. More locally, small development that we did for a Hong Kong client. It's residential. I don't know if you recognise it, 226 Hollywood Road. It's not very big. It was 5 apartments and retail on the ground floor. But what was big about it was that really, as far as I understand it, up to that point, developers had always done that thing of knocking down a building and building this big glass shiny thing. Whereas what we discussed was how it was possible to build something that really built on the character of the neighbourhood. Now, there's no getting away from it. It is gentrification. But there's not much one can also do about that in Hong Kong. It's what's happening here. But you can keep the sense of neighbourhood. So we built something that continued the scale and the materiality of the neighbourhood. One that looked inhabited from the outside, so that when the lights are on, you can see people are in. That, again, is something that tends not to happen in modern developments. They are inward-looking, so it's a bit like a kind of tooth knocked out in the mouth. The street slowly dies. And then, within the building, we tried to create what we call a frame for life. So make these spaces that were rather flexible, but yet still had that possibility of being broken down into smaller rooms in the Asian way. We used granite from a local quarry. We took the materiality of the outside of the building inside, so it felt solid, not that kind of thin, shiny application of expensive materials. The idea that you could just drop your personality on top of this frame, that you didn't have to just go in and live the shiny life, that it could be appropriated and inhabited by people on the move. And the materiality, which I'm sure you can see is something that's very important to us, that physical connection with your environment. Because we're animals, we're sensorial creatures. We like to feel where we are. And again, what was interesting was there was a sort of grown-up session at the end where some of the older mentors of my client came around and were saying, it'll never work, it'll never work. I did things like that when I was young. You know, it'll never work, you'll see. But they sold in weeks, all of them. And one guy even sent us an email to London. He said, I went to see it at 1 o'clock and I fell in love with him so much, I bought 2 by 9. So, it did work. On another scale, the George Jensen project. Small objects in daily life. We based the whole idea on the Danish notion of Hugo, which is this notion that all events, no matter how small, matter. And looking around, thinking about the things that I'd seen, one of the things that I realised was very missing was, you know, it sounds really boring, but actually I think so much of what's interesting starts in a boring place. What do you do with all that stuff in your pockets? I mean, I'm constantly chasing around the flat looking for my keys, my cards, you know, or you've got that sort of stuff you put next to your bed or in the bathroom. How could you actually accept that that's what it is and make it beautiful? How could you do that thing that Milan Kundera, the writer, says is happiness is the desire for repetition? How could you actually make it a lovely thing to find your keys? And what's more, know where to find your keys? So, yeah, that's really the starting point of this. And then framed at either end by this notion of the candle and the water, the sort of archetypal things that you begin and end the day with. I saw these things as things that would really sit in the back of your life. They underpin your life. They're not things to necessarily be on the front. Things you can love quietly. Also, looking at George Jensen, the company, we wanted it to play to their long history of beautiful fluid lines, but also warm up their palette, because at that point, a couple of years ago, they were really using silver, stainless steel, and it felt quite hard, quite masculine, I guess. So bringing in these yellow metals, the black glass, gave a variety of materials, gave it a bit of life. Once again, we did a film to communicate the way we feel.
Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing us your very elegant and very sentimental spaces and product range. So it's time for us again to have this Q&A.
Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I have probably maybe a boring question, but very interesting for me to find out from you is that because you're working with interior space and they consist of many different objects, many different level of details, and I think most people working with the interior space, whether they're professional or not, they think they have a very good idea about how things aren't, and what they like, what they don't like. What I think also is probably what I'm very impressed about how you keep control of your interior space is that how do you handle this sort of issue when you work with your clients? And I guess they often have very strong ideas about things, and they may not go well with your ideas, but then you sort of have such a great control of how you keep things together. And how do you communicate that to the client? How do you keep control of all these small objects and things that you actually I mean, I've seen also the way you even go to arrange a library, and you know, you really manage to sort of go down to small detail. How do you do that?
It's a very good question, because you're absolutely right. One of the issues about interiors, but it goes back to my point about them not really being taken as seriously as architecture, is that everybody thinks that they have an opinion about it. And it's extraordinary, isn't it? Because you cannot imagine somebody going to a restaurant, you know, ordering, and then going to the kitchen and going, I think you should perhaps put a bit more like this in, and no, I really, or, you know, hiring a lawyer and starting to pull apart the clauses. You know, it's amazing. But it is like that. So the important thing we find is designing their minds. I think I'm very, very lucky to have had time as a journalist. It's funny because sometimes people go, so how did you change profession? And sometimes I think, you know what, 80% of my job is actually communicating what we're going to do. It's been so valuable because we really build a big story in advance about what they are going to get at the end. That is, I can't stress how important it is, the big idea. So that constantly when people start to go, I think that chair's better, or what about that, or my wife likes that, you can say, yeah, it's great. However, if we look back at what we're heading for, it doesn't really work. And 9 times out of 10, they agree. Sometimes not, though. It doesn't always go right. But the most important thing is to get them to buy in to the vision of what's going to happen at the end. And that's about communication, working out how to do it, which is partly why we are very strong on film and illustration and anything, music, whatever it takes to communicate the final idea. Because you have to keep people going. I mean, you know, buildings can take years. You know, Et Hem took 4 years. Not the whole time, but because it got locked in planning and people complaining about it changing use. Slightly different here, I think. But, you know, the process is a long one and an expensive one. Thank you.
您好，我觉得刚才您的演讲确实是有一些文艺的气息充满了在里面，然后体现了一个女性设计师的细腻和唯美。我特别欣赏刚才您演讲当中的有一句话是这样：设计不一定是大的事情，也可以是安静的、可以静静爱着的事情。我觉得这一句话特别的唯美。我想了解，就是您最喜欢的阅读的书是哪一本？谢谢。
Not particularly. What you definitely can see, though, is an obsession with well-being. I'm head of the Department of Wellbeing, Man and Wellbeing in Eindhoven, and so I'm very focused on the way that things connect to us, physically, emotionally, sensorially. I'm very interested in how to create spaces where people feel good. And I think what's conventionally called the masculine design, but actually I don't think it is. I think it's more the design of the 20th century. It's a sort of industrial design, if you like, is much more about symbols. So I think it's probably more of a 20th, 21st century divide than it is a male-female one. And it's about looking at space from the way it affects you, rather than simply as sort of visual symbols.
In your quest to make spaces that feel alive, what kind of projects excite you? What makes you decide to take on a project and that will make you wake up with excitement to design?
A project where we can make a difference. So obviously I showed a few hospitality projects here, but actually I am just as fascinated by, for example, the Fogo one, which I found completely amazing. How you can learn so much from these guys. I mean, they're fishermen on an island which has had a cod moratorium, and we were able to do a project because the client was really on board and had courage to do a project which has brought money to the island, which has created jobs and hopefully will create more jobs in the future. I think the idea that design can be part of a story that makes positive change is really exciting. And we're very happy always to be part of something bigger. You know, we are also quite comfortable with this notion of design as the invisible hand. It doesn't always have to have our name on it. It's more if it can make a difference. And if we've got something to learn, and if we have a client who is really prepared to embrace that process.
Okay, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give another round of applause for Ms. Ilse Crawford.